I'm so excited to bring you this special conversation on equity in law school admissions, recruitment, rankings, and debt. For those of you who are new, my name is Sydney Montgomery, and I'm a law school admission consultant specializing in working with first generation and minority applicants. I had the wonderful opportunity of moderating this panel between myself, Kellye Testy, the CEO and president of the Law School Admission Council, Dean Vincent Rougeau, the Dean of Boston College Law School, President of the American Association for Law Schools, and incoming President at the College of the Holy Cross, and Kyle McEntee, the Executive Director of Law School Transparency. I hope you'll enjoy this presentation as much as I enjoyed being a part of this conversation. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation on equity and law school admissions. Today, we are going to touch on 4 different topics. We're going to talk about equity in enrollment. We're going to talk about financial equity. We're going to talk about information asymmetry. And then we're going to talk about the impact of rankings on equity in law school admissions. I'm so excited for this conversation. Thank you all for being here with me today.
Good to be with you.
Awesome. So we're gonna just jump right in. I'd love to talk about equity and admission. And when I say equity, I really want to know can we focus on making sure that law school is accessible, not just for one group of people, but for a multitude of people, no matter where they are in their career, in life, and personally.
Soon to be President Rougeau, I'm going to defer to you.
Okay. Well, I think one of the big barriers to, to broad access is cost. And, I think people perceive rightly that law school is very expensive. And so often may say, I don't know if I want to do that. I can't afford it. And then if they hear that, well, there are loans available, there are ways to get help. People worry rightfully about debt, and they're concerned about putting themselves in a situation where, in order to get a degree, they're going to be sort of digging themselves out of a financial hole. And so, it takes a lot of, sort of contextualizing of the circumstances that allow people to go to law school, to finish law school, and to manage those issues, manage debt, and to make good career choices that a lot of people just don't get. So they're dissuaded early on from exploring so that they can find that information and learn answers to some of the questions, because there are a lot of answers to those questions. I know we're going to talk some more about some of those other pieces later, but those are just the first 2 that jump to my mind to begin with.
I'll build on that a little bit. I think those are so critical, and I'm so glad we're starting the conversation around equity, because I think that one of the things we all should acknowledge at the start is that access to learning and access to advising are really unequally distributed in our world. And I think we have to confront that at the outset and understand that that's so, and then really take active measures to disrupt that inequality. And that's really what I and the Law School Admission Council are thinking about all the time, is how do you really reach out and make sure that you're helping all you can to build the awareness of the law school opportunity. But then just knowing of the opportunity is not enough. The potential candidates need support along that journey, and they also need to have the support and the access to the learning that will enable them to succeed in that process and once they get to law school. And that, I think, is really important, that we see that it's really 3 steps. It's open the opportunity, support on the journey, and then provide that skill building opportunity and the ability to build the skills that will help thrive in law school. And it's one of the reasons why, I always like to make sure people realize that the law school admission test is an on-ramp to that learning. This is not a test just to be a test. It's the 3 fundamental skills that enable success in law school: writing, reading, and analyzing. And that helps the applicants really make sure that then when they make that investment, because as Dean and soon to be President Rougeau note, it's expensive, then they know whether they have the ability to really thrive and to make that career successful.
Absolutely. I love what you said about it's not just support at the beginning, but it's support throughout the entire process. I know that there are pipeline programs, a number of diversity programs at schools and at firms through LSAC. How are those programs helping? Are there ways they could be better? And just how can we think about that access line a little bit?
Sure, I'll start on that, and I think that there are so many of them, and I'm so glad because there needs to be. You know, when we were chatting, Sydney, at the start, you noted that even a wonderful school that you went to as an undergrad didn't have a pre-law advisor, and so many institutions do, some don't. Some are more really familiar with the process than others are not. So, and so there are a lot of different kinds of pipeline programs out there. What's unfortunate about them is many of them are poorly funded and poorly staffed. People are asked to do it as kind of on the top of their job instead of their main job. And so one of the things that we've long tried to do is provide stable funding for pipeline programs that are successful and to try and help build capacity. And that's something that I personally would really like to see LSAC together with law schools and pre-law advisors continue to work on, is helping to bring that together in better collaboration to really understand what works in these programs, to share those best practices, and then to make sure that we're all learning from one another so that it's more than a sum of the parts. And our plus programs, our pre-law undergraduate programs have been a long-standing successful on-ramp to law school. There are many other wonderful examples, but I do think that one of the things that most all of them need is more personnel and more funding to really do the kind of open the opportunity, provide the support, and give the skills acquisition that we really need to do. That's time-intensive work. And it requires a real investment of understanding and effort.
Yeah, I would imagine that they also need funding to make sure that people even know about the pipeline programs. Because I think that there's that little piece there. It's like, I didn't even know about any pipeline programs until I graduated, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I agree with you. And one of the things that has helped with this is that about 3 years ago now, we started a very aggressive digital outreach campaign on behalf of legal education as a whole to help reach to communities that may not have knowledge of pipeline programs or the opportunity of law school. And that has been remarkable in its success. We have something like 70,000 new visitors to lsac.org now each and every year because of this work that we do that otherwise wouldn't have had the knowledge of how to start. And so, we have to meet people where they are. And today it's often on their smartphones or online somewhere, and really help broaden that reach so that we can start to knit together the community support that's required. I'll mention one other quick thing on that is that, you I'm sure know that we started two different free LSAT prep programs, one that we do in partnership with the Khan Academy, and the other we do ourselves, and it's called Law Hub. But again, one of the things that's great about those is they are free, but they do take a discipline because they're self-guided then. And so another thing that I know I'm always trying to figure out is how could we create the Uber app for matching somebody up with, a coaching experience while they're going through that, so they have support from an existing lawyer or law student even to help guide them on that journey.
Another thing about pipelining, even as you noted, Sydney, even in institutions that you would expect would have a rich and kind of multifaceted set of programs or access to information about law school, we've often found that the people charged with providing the information, be they faculty or pre-law advisors, often aren't really giving very sophisticated advice. So you have, for instance, in some undergraduate schools, faculty who themselves have not gone to law school, who have PhDs, who would rather talk about how to get into a good PhD program, and are sometimes disappointed when their bright students choose to go to law school or medical school or whatever. And that's not to criticize them for wanting to steer people into things that are interesting to them, but we need people in these contexts who have, who really understand the current circumstances of legal education. And one of the things I want to point out about that is that it's very complex. There are so many different choices. There are, close to 200 law schools. There are lots of different reasons to pick different schools. There are lots of different circumstances that might address the needs of particular students in particular ways. And, those resources are there, but, someone has to sit down and spend the time understanding where they are, or they need to have come out of a context in which they were, sort of surrounded by that information so that they can provide it appropriately. So one thing we need to see in terms of resources, is to get people who are doing the counseling, some counseling, to get them to have the information they need. And if that means, getting, providing programming for pre-law counselors, if that means, talking to undergraduate schools about who they assign that work to, that's a whole segment, because you have to go to undergraduate school to go to law school.
Right.
That's one part you can't skip. So we need to make sure that the information being provided there is sound.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, I know that Kyle has been working really hard on the pre-law platform to provide training for pre-law advisors, because I agree, it's important that anyone who is giving law school admissions advice is giving ethical, sound, quality, researched advice. And I think there's kind of a dearth of professional development in this area. And so I really applaud Kyle Law School Transparency and the pre-law platform for making those steps to try to get training out to everyone. I actually wanted to talk, I know that you started talking in the beginning about the financial issues with going to law school. So I want to transition a little bit to talking about financial equity. And actually, I would like, Kyle, if you could just summarize, what is the situation as it relates to financial equity in law school right now?
Yeah, well, we've got a pre-law school problem and we've got a problem during law school, and both of these together exacerbate a post-law school problem. So I guess I think maybe start with talking about the pre-law school problem. One of the, I think, biggest complaints that I hear from pre-law advisors and students is that the cost of applying to law school is just, it's so high. And this really affects most those who come from low-income backgrounds. And the consequences to this are pretty grave, I think. So I think students apply to fewer schools than they otherwise would, which means that they, unless they have really good information on the front end about which schools they should be applying to, they're less likely to be making optimal choices. It also means fewer law schools to negotiate with and against, and putting them against each other to try to get the best price. And accordingly, you may therefore pay more for law school. And that's on top of the fact that it's just the actual expenses itself. They can be draining for someone who has rent obligations or other family obligations, childcare obligations, wants to eat, all these things. The ability to borrow is a really important decision that our government's made, and ensuring that no one will lack the funds to go to law school. But those loans don't cover the cost of applying to law school. And that's a huge problem, I think. Not necessarily that they should, but that it's so expensive that does have these real consequences on the decisions people make, and really ultimately where they're going to be successful, how much they're going to pay, and how satisfied they'll be.
Absolutely.
One thing I should mention there while Kyle's talking about that, so if candidates are watching, is that we do have a fee waiver program that covers not only the costs of taking the LSAT and taking the prep class through our Law Hub, but also covers the costs of applying. And we invest over $5 million every year in that program, and we will continue to do that. We've also, for the last 3 years, held fees flat rather than see any increases, even though our costs have been rising dramatically, like I know all law schools' costs are as well. And that's something that I just want candidates to know that we'll continue to work on. What I would love to see is some, organization or institutions start to invest in providing additional fee waivers for applicants. Because, a lot of, what we do is I think, address the most serious need, financial need. But as Kyle notes, it's a stretch for a lot of people. And I think that that's something where if all of us joined together and thought about, is there somewhere that might have some kind of funding to enable more scholarships there to supplement the 5 million that LSAC does every year, that would be, a wonderful turn. So it is something that I know I feel strongly about as a first-gen college grad myself and I hope that we can all continue to focus on not only the costs of going, the cost of preparing to go. And that's also why I think the free tools for prep are so important. And the efficacy of those are proving to be very, very strong. So it is a really good option for applicants.
And I think on that, it's a question of scaling what you can scale, and then finding ways to provide that bespoke advice when possible past what you can't scale. And so I think that applies to test prep on the LSAT. So, Khan Academy is a wonderful tool. I've poked around on there. I've heard great reviews from students on this. But there's also a need for some people to have that personalized, tailored advice on how do I create my study schedule with my particular circumstances, or how do I achieve my specific score goal. And the more we scale what's scalable, the easier it is to figure out where those holes can be filled. And I think the same thing applies for advice for where to apply to school, what to put in your test, in your essays, and then also for advisors to help them with their professional development. And that's, again, as Cindy mentioned, we have this new pre-law platform that we're in the middle of launching, and it's all based on this same premise of scale what you can scale, and then figure out how to bridge the rest of the gap once you've scaled that. And I think that's the way to go to really begin to crack down on these huge structural problems that we're all trying to face together.
Yeah, the legal profession overall needs to work on the one-to-many issue for sure.
I think one of the things that particularly worries me is that there was a 2017 study that said that the median LSAT score for Black applicants was a 142, right? And so, for those of you who don't know, the LSAT is on a scale out of 180, and a 142 is below the medians of almost all schools. And so I guess I'm wondering, in terms of this financial equity piece, a lot of students end up spending so much money, even though there are free LSAT resources. You did mention it does require discipline and self-study, and depending on the kind of academic training they've had before, or where they're coming from, self-study doesn't always work for all students, or they're not able to get a score that's going to get them into a school. What are the ways that we can kind of bridge that achievement gap outside of, just spend more money on LSAT tutors and extensive prep?
Yeah,
I think that's really important. The score issue, I think, raises huge economic inequality issues. Unfortunately, the way that funding for financial aid works in law schools is that, law schools are sort of competing. They're in this rugby scrum, for students that meet their medians or exceed them, for rankings reasons. And we're going to talk about rankings too. But I think without getting into that portion of it, it's very, very, very important for first-gen students of color, particularly those who may be scoring lower on these metrics, to recognize that, not pairing the school choice with the opportunities that the school offers for financial aid based on your entering metrics means that you're spending more money to go to school. And, if, financing your education is an issue, if going into debt is an issue, one of your goals should be, how can I maximize the financial support I can get from the institutions that I'm applying to? And, institutions themselves do a lot of things. We were talking about the application fees. Well, most law schools increasingly, certainly, the top 50 schools waive the fee if you ask, or, with very little documentation will waive it. So that goes to the issue of information asymmetry. People need to just know that they can ask for these things and they'll get them, and that will eliminate one problem. You don't have to pay the fee. But in terms of how people perform on these tests, or there are other things that are also important. I mean, sometimes having a very high GPA can offer you a lot of leverage in the admissions process that can counterbalance a relatively low LSAT and then bump you back into relatively higher pools for financial aid. But students need to understand that's money is being handed out based on entering metrics. There are other sources of money. There are other ways that money is being handed out. Diversity is a real goal for a lot of law schools, and they're also, funding that as well. But, that's this need for this broader, sophisticated understanding of the process of admission, a more sophisticated understanding of what schools are able to provide and what you can ask for. And really, at the end of the day, more knowledge before people apply to graduate schools and like law school of, financial awareness, just basic understandings of, what it means to be in debt, what it means to be living off loans, what it means to be financing your education. I mean, what are the consequences of various types of choices in that circumstance? And I think if we could give students more information just about the arc of life that you're on. I am a student, I'm borrowing money, there's a reason for this. It means I have to make certain kinds of choices after that. But if I make the first choice about how much I borrow a certain way, I have a broader set of choices later. All those kinds of questions, that will help us go a long way to broadening the number of people who feel more comfortable making the choice to come to law school in the first place.
Yeah. Might add just a couple thoughts to that. I agree with that so strongly. And I have, I think, to add some policy choices that we ought to all be working on while we give that greater transparency to applicants, because I think the most immediate thing is giving that greater transparency so that those choices, can be made and understood. But meanwhile, I think we have to work on a number of things. And I'd start, Sydney, you ask, what can we do about the fact that there are academic measurement gaps? And I think we need strong policies at the national level about funding for public education, because there are those gaps in any measurement. They exist in GPAs, they exist in SATs, they exist in anything that you want to put a number to. And that's because access to learning is unequal in our world, and the quality of education is unequal. And so as a big policy matter, we need to really invest in education in a way we have not for decades in this country. The second thing I think we really need to do is we need to continue to really rely on data and research. And the research is clear that equity will be best promoted if the LSAT is used as one factor in a holistic admission process, not the factor, one factor. And we're very clear about that, even though, of course, we are the LSAT people. And so I, urge a reminder of that. It was not designed to give out scholarships on. It was designed to predict success in the first year of law school. And it does that extraordinarily well. It adds 60% accuracy to that prediction, which is by far better than any GPA or anything else there is. But I think just helping educate about it is a holistic process. And I think, as Dean Rougeau noted, schools are wanting to think more and more about that holistically, to say to candidates, you're not just numbers. And so, talk to us in your personal statement, talk to us in your application, get good advice from people like you, Sydney, to how to do that. And I think that we need to keep, as a community in our ecosystem, focused on holistic admission and making that real.
Yes, absolutely. I always tell my students, you are more than a number. I know that it's just so difficult, I think, especially for students that have been out of school for a little bit
Of
to
course.
get into that, the timing and the metrics. But I do think that it is about shoring up those skills before you even get to the point of taking your LSAT. It really
Yes,
starts, really starts probably before you even go to college,
it does.
building those skills. So
Yeah,
absolutely, I agree with that for
yeah.
sure.
And getting the word out to young people to take rigorous classes, to work on the critical thinking skills, the writing skills, because but again, that's also a quality of education issue. A lot of my psychometricians research shows that the quality of education, even in the middle school and high school level, is a lot of why we see the persistent inequalities. So
Right, right.
that's a core area.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know we've talked a lot about financial equity going to law school before you move into, and we've talked a little bit about information asymmetry. I just want to see, are there ways that we can bridge or close some of the inequities after students go to law school? Granted, they've made decisions that are, going to affect their after, but how can we kind of bridge that? Kyle, I know that you do a lot of work with financial transparency and consumer information. How can we bridge that gap after graduation? Or in law school even?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is confronting the data and acknowledging that there are actual equity problems in the price people pay and the amount they borrow. So there's compelling evidence from the law school survey of student engagement, LSAC. It's always tough for me to get that one out. That students of color pay and borrow more for law school than their white counterparts, only to earn less after law school. And the same patterns likely actually also affect women, although there's less compelling evidence there. It's not that there's evidence to the contrary, it's just that we have no less about it. But I think a big part of this is to acknowledge that, okay, we see that this happens at a national level. We need the data at the school level to show the prices paid by demographic, the debt borrowed, or the amount of student loans borrowed by demographic. That way schools can confront the choices that they're making and say, okay, we are emphasizing or overemphasizing the LSAT. We're overemphasizing GPA in the name of the rankings game. And the consequence of this is that we end up with a weird distribution of financial aid, moving the resources away from need-based towards merit-based. And even calling it merits just wrong in my view, but as it's constituted, called merit aid. And I think this needs to happen through the ABA. The ABA needs to require, as part of their just disclosures under Standard 509, that schools say how they allocate their financial aid by race, by gender, how students borrow by race, by gender, and even part-time versus full-time. And I think once those patterns emerge, it'll be a lot more difficult for schools to continue their policies because they'll be confronted by the fact that they do things that contribute to the inequity in our profession.
Mm, 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 mm. Absolutely. Information really on all levels is, I think, one of the core foundational issues to equity. I know, Dean Rougeau, you were talking about people not even knowing that they can ask for fee waivers. For me, the thing that gets me is that same study said that the plurality of Black applicants apply to law school in March, as opposed to their white, Asian, and even Hispanic counterparts who apply earlier in the cycle, like November. And I think that I continually tell students that it's a rolling application cycle, but it seems like that information, which is pretty core and basic to the admissions process, doesn't actually get disseminated down. And even worse, I know that sometimes students will tell me, well, but the deadline that the school says is March, April, May, but I called admissions and admissions said that they're still going to take my application even though it's June. And it just, it really like makes me upset because I feel like everyone should have this general base knowledge that can really affect you. So how do we get this kind of knowledge into the general understanding so it's just universally known?
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, you are trying, we've talked about a lot of different places where the information fails, right? It doesn't, it's not getting to where it needs to be. But I think this goes back to some things we've talked about earlier in terms of, funding at a broader level of education, right? I mean, there should be national resources, federal resources, state resources on providing information about access to various opportunities in higher education that are easily accessible to everyone, in the same way that people have access to information about, their healthcare choices or whatever. I think we just don't take it seriously enough as well, let me put it differently. There's such a wide diversity across this country toward how, in terms of how higher education is viewed and how important it's considered to be. And there clearly are, and I think we need to say this, there are clearly active efforts amongst some in this country at the highest levels of government to undermine access to education and to, connect their political, social, and economic agendas to delegitimizing the effort for people's efforts to educate themselves, particularly at the graduate level. We need to understand that that's happening, and in those places where that's not happening, we need to talk to state legislators. We need to talk to our federal representatives to say, if you're really serious about diversity, equity, inclusion, you've got to understand that there are just basic pieces of information that aren't getting to students, which is undermining their ability to be successful in the process, despite all the other things we're trying to do to give them access to the process. I mean, if you're applying late and the class is full, the class is full. So, that's not going to help you. It's not going to help us. But, if you know that, that there are these strategic choices you can make that will maximize your position in the applicant pool, you can at least have a fighting chance. Now, where should that information come from? Clearly, it has to come from undergraduate schools, like we talked about. Clearly, it has to come from pre-law advisors. Clearly, the LSAC and law school transparency are doing what they can do to get that information out. But there needs to be a basic choice that, look, this is important. It's important that access is provided. So we need to find other ways to push that information out.
Mm-hmm. That's an expensive endeavor. I mean, the biggest struggle my organization has is reaching people early enough in the process to really make a difference in their decision making. And that goes to what schools you apply to, when, which are both required to make the good choice in the end. And LSAC, you have such great access to students, but I think even as Dean Rougeau said, it's not early enough. It really has to be the undergraduate institutions. And again, that's why we're really trying to get this pre-law platform up and running, because if we can get students into an ecosystem that's valuable to them on a career basis, then maybe they stand a better fighting shot at a better outcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would just agree with all that. Information asymmetry is a terrible thing, and it always breaks along racial and class and gender and other lines. And so we have to just disrupt it everywhere we can. We spend an enormous amount of effort trying, and we do webinars, and they reach a lot of people. The digital outreach I mentioned, they're working with the ecosystems and reaching out with programs like street law into high schools. There are law-themed high schools that we connect with. There's just an enormous number of things that we do, while realizing it's not enough, because those asymmetries are really deep. I can share that in the near term, one of the things that we're working on is being able to reach earlier into the pipeline. We'll have some, I think, good announcements that will help with this in the coming months. But it is really necessary. And the other side of it that I'd like to urge us to think about too is that we all know that they exist. So then what we should do is know that no matter how hard we try and disrupt them, we're never going to succeed completely. So let's build our policies and practices knowing they exist and knowing we can't get rid of them. And so why do we have to do rolling? Why couldn't we have a date, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, the reason is that competition among schools starts to put pressure and competitive pressure on that. So but that's a choice that we made. So I think talking about these issues and thinking about how might we structure our policies and practices, knowing that there are these asymmetries and trying to reduce their impact.
Right. Or even if it was rolling, being a little bit more honest with yourself about the dates. There's no reason to have a deadline in May. Like maybe let's make that deadline in February when you know that your class generally fills, or something that would signal to applicants a little bit more that they need to have an earlier application. I know one of the reasons that I actually, pivoted from practicing law to doing this full time is that when I started doing content marketing, and putting information out there, I was overwhelmed with the number of people who told me that they had never seen someone like me. Some people had told me they were really I was the first Black lawyer that they've ever spoken to still in 2021. And it made me realize that we need more information, yes, but we also need information coming from a more representative source. I know one of the things that I'm actively trying to do is put out as much free content as possible, like putting out several YouTube videos a week, a free guide, anything that I can do, because I know that for some people, they consume information solely on YouTube, or they consume information solely on Instagram, or they might be learning how to apply to law school from TikTok. So how can we, reach people where they're at, but then also give them someone that looks like them so they can say, okay, this is relatable advice. I'm going to listen to her because, she seems like someone that was like me, or he seems like someone that's gone through what I've been through. I think that too often what I see is mostly advice coming from white men. And I think there's a lot of students who feel like they don't resonate with that, or that it doesn't apply to their circumstances, or that advice could never work for them. And so
Yeah.
I think having more representative advice would be really helpful.
I think
totally
something that
agree.
Dean Rougeau said earlier really strikes me as important to think about, which is that pipelining is a verb. It's not just a noun. And I think as I just listened to this entire discussion, it's incumbent to always look at it as something you actively do at all points, knowing where we're trying to get, which is a more equitable profession that can actually deliver legal services to the people who need it. Because that's the big problem that's kind of the back of all of this, which is we have a huge access to justice problem. It falls down racial lines and it falls down socioeconomic lines. And law school is one way of addressing that. It's not the only way. Put a plug in for regulatory change of the legal profession. But we have to at all points look at it as an active thing we're doing. And so I don't know. Dean Rougeau, I really love that you called it pipelining earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Dean Rougeau, though, you also mentioned that like a lot of this starts at the undergrad. And so I have questions for students that are 30, 40, 50 going to law school, who don't have any connections to their undergrad, perhaps at this point, or who maybe didn't even go to undergrad in this country, who are immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
How can we get more access to that group of people?
Well, that's a group that I think offers kind of a win-win for like law schools and for the for the individuals in that group, because law schools I think are constantly thinking about how to expand their applicant pool. I mean, this year maybe not, but in most years we want to see a broad. We want to bring law school to a broader cross section of people, and certainly second career folks, older students. Those are all really great potential students for law school. One thing we've tried to do at BC, just to give an example from my personal experience, is we've tried to identify workspaces where we have noticed more and more applicants coming in for a second career people. So I mean, and one obvious one is paralegals, but a pretty wide cross section of people work in paralegals. A lot of them have been doing it for 20 years, and they decide they want to go to law school. So getting the law firms involved and disseminating information about law schools, getting other types of employers where we would see the potential for students. There are a lot of jobs like in Boston that are in the healthcare space that bring in, and interestingly, a lot of people who are educated abroad, who for whatever reason haven't been able to, get themselves more highly credentialed in this country. And then they find out that a law degree might be something that would be interesting to them. We can get into those organizations that serve those workers and tell them about law school. So that's, just one school trying to do things. But when you see that, you can think more broadly, what could we be doing as, legal education, and the ABA and other groups to, just put ourselves in front of more people to give them just the type of information we're talking about. People who, because they're older, actually might absorb it more easily and more quickly because they've had a little more experience in the world and would be, great potential lawyers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Go ahead, Dean Testy.
I was only going to add that one of the questions you asked earlier, you referenced, like, it's not just pre-law, it's also law school, and it's also what happens afterward. And I do want to just say that one of the frames I think we also need to make sure we're keeping a focus on here is that is an entire learning journey, as I like to call it, for the student. And we need to think about that holistically as well, because right now at every stage of that, there's drop off in terms of the diverse people coming into the legal profession. And in many ways, the drop off in the profession is probably the most deeply concerning at the moment, if you match that to demographics of the population overall. So I think it's something that we also need to keep talking about, because bringing people, building really robust pipeline, a fair admission process, and then the kind of support in law school too. Because what we're seeing is that the LSAT actually over predicts a bit success in law school for minoritized communities. And my own belief is that that's because once people get to law school, they don't feel the sense of belonging that they need to thrive academically. And so working on that belonging so people are achieving to their full potential in law school, and then working on a fair licensure system, which is right now undergoing a lot of reform, and I'm happy to see that. And then into practice, where we're really talking about, opportunity and coaching and retention and all the things that help make sure that we aren't losing our wonderful lawyers, at that stage.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who probably contributed to that drop off since I don't practice anymore, I can definitely say that I think what I've always been interested in is, like, when you want to go to med school, you kind of have an idea of like what science involves. And while you don't fully know what med school is like, I feel like you have a more firm picture. I think that there still exists a really large disparity in people even knowing what being a lawyer means. Like they have an idea, sort of, but it's just one of those things where you really don't know until you're in it. And I think we can do a lot more to give people that information, so that they're not just basing it off of an idea in their head that doesn't end up being in reality. I know for me, and I loved my time in law school, and I enjoyed practicing. I enjoyed the firm that I worked for, a small all-female family law firm, and so that was a really empowering experience. But I would say that what I wanted for my values and my work life, and just what I envisioned, was so different than what it ended up being, and not necessarily like, oh, so much worse, but I just realized that there was a great divide between what I had in my head and what it was in reality. And I think if you had asked me different questions when I was younger, do you enjoy paperwork? Even for one, right? And of course, no one really enjoys paperwork, but I think that there are things that we can kind of ask to get at that. I read Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, and she had this part in her book that really resonated with me. And it was about how she would tell people that she wants to be a lawyer. And people would say, oh, that's so great, fantastic. And it checked the box. And I feel like that happens a lot without ever getting questioned. You're just like, yeah, okay, I want to be a lawyer. And no one ever stopped me or asked me why, or asked me, well, how do you know? They're just like, good for you, Sydney, that's great. And so I think that there could be more conversation about that in college, in high school, with career fairs, all of that, because it could have been very, I mean, I'm very happy with the way things turned out, but I definitely think that it could have been very informative for me.
So we have a podcast that LSAC has generously funded a portion of called I'm the Law. And I mean, we agree completely with that premise of there's just a lack of information and then misinformation just kind of runs amok. And getting people access to that information, whether it's in podcast form or we're actually turning these into books at some point, trying to reach people where they are to help them see what practice is like and make sure that they hear from voices that look like them. Because I think that's one of the things that attracted the podcast to LSAC was that we have a philosophy of making sure we overrepresent groups that are underrepresented in the profession, because it's so important for people to see themselves in the lawyers that are out there. Even if they're underrepresented, they are out there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, if I may, Sydney, just
Yeah.
connect a couple dots here too, because it's not only what lawyers do, but what do people who are educated in law do? Because it's so much broader. You know, law is a wonderful degree in complex problem solving. It's useful in so many ways, and people with law degrees do so many things. But I also want to say that I think we need to, as a legal academy, start thinking more about teaching law than just educating lawyers. And that can dovetail with the point Kyle makes about regulatory reform. You know, I'm really in favor of more limited practice categories. You know, in Washington State, we were one of the early ones with one. But I think it's, you know, our access to justice gap is so terribly deep that wide that we need to have more people who can provide legal services of some kind. And that opens up a lot of ways for people to come into law and to see that it's a really big, you know, the legal services profession is huge. There are all kinds of ways to contribute, whether it's paralegals and lawyers and judges and you know, in criminal justice, so many ways. So that's something else that I think we all could take on as broadening out a little bit too.
I think a really great example of that is happening with Michelle Pistone at Villanova with immigration
I
advocacy.
agree.
And it's such an example of how a legal education can be used to produce people who do really excellent work in lawyer adjacent workplaces. And I think it's such an example of what the future should be, and I hope will be.
Yeah, we're big supporters of hers and totally see that as a as wonderful contribution in the immigration space. I mean, it's terrific.
Absolutely. So, on the topic of lawyers and all the different things that people can do with their law degree and all the ways that the law can serve them, I would love to talk about this issue of rankings, which is such a hot button topic because it's so intertwined with this notion of employment for so many people. And it is just a chicken and egg situation. So I'd love to first talk about how much do employers care about rankings, and are rankings really just a proxy for prestige?
Well, it strikes me that employers care a lot about rankings, but not all employers care about them the same way. And I think the first thing we have to recognize is when we're thinking about rankings and who cares a lot about them, the people who care about them the most are big law firms. I mean, not exclusively. I mean, there are some other elite employers, let's call them that also really care about it. But big law, I think, drives this fascination with pecking order in law schools. And it's not always rational. So, I mean, you know, there is some regional variation. So for instance, a lot of big firms all want to hire from, say, the top 10 schools without too much thought. But, you know, they favor certain schools in their region over other schools in other parts of the country that may be more highly ranked. So one thing to remember is that, you know, people care about the things and places that they know. And when they have a tradition of hiring from certain institutions in their region, they tend to go back to them if they've had good success with that. So that's important. But it also is, I think, a reason for students to recognize too that, you know, you cannot go into law school entirely fixated on everything that really drives people into big law firm practice. There's nothing wrong with that. It's great. It offers many, many opportunities. But to the point we just left, right? There are a range of reasons to get a law degree and a range of things you can do with a law degree. And so, you know, rankings really don't say much about a lot of those other things. They really aren't connected to a lot of those other things. How well you do in school clearly has some bearing on it. But, you know, most law schools can produce people who are going to be highly competent in whatever they choose to do. So that's not really the problem. The bigger problem with rankings, I think, goes to access, because I think, you know, rankings, you know, create a world in which students often make poor choices about which schools to attend, because they believe that it's worth whatever investment they make, whatever loans they take out to go to a school that's slightly more highly ranked than another one, when in fact it's not a good school for them. But, you know, they have been convinced that their prospects for employment and success in the profession are going to be driven by the fact that school A is 25 and school B is 35, when in fact school B is in a market where they want to live. So, you know, those are just some basic, I mean, we could go on for hours about rankings as a dean, it drives me crazy, but those are some key points that I would start with.
I think for the advisors listening, wondering, how do I combat this desire my students have to use the rankings? Just because the rankings reflect at the very top end the prestige orientation of the big firms doesn't mean that that's the best or only way to get at that. You can look at other data saying where do the big firms hire from, or which schools have the largest placement in big firms. Because yes, the rankings are pretty good at the top for, you know, the relative order, or at least relative positioning relative to the rest of all, like say 180 or 190 schools. They don't do a good job everywhere else. And so we should try to, I think we kind of can throw out the rankings as a useful tool for making decisions and not run away from the fact that there is some kind of hierarchy in the profession. I think there's other ways to get that information to students and get them to focus on that information instead of, you know, this ordinal ranking that will pit, you know, a 25 versus 35, which, you know, seems like it's a sensible thing to do when U.S. News says the best school is ranked higher than, you know, a less great school or whatever. Yeah, I with like Dean Rougeau, I can go on for hours about this in different directions.
I used to say when I was a dean that if I had my 3 magic wishes, I'd get rid of racism, poverty, and U.S. News. You know, but really the truth of the matter is, I think, is as long as there's more than one, we're going to rank. You know, it's just like the way it seems like the human mind works. And I think a lot of our thrashing around about them is probably better channeled toward educating about them. And, you know, and trying to get the word out about really what they are, what they're not, what they include, what they don't, to not make a distinction based on a 25 versus a 22 or a 50 versus a, you know, 43, you know, these kinds of things that I think when we don't get information out, it can start to seem like how you decide, you know, you just look at there and draw the line. So, but I do think as well that there are better and worse things to include in any set of rankings, and that the current one is so reputationally driven is very self-reinforcing. It's very hard to move that when that's such a huge part of the weight. And I know that people often think the LSAT is weighted too heavily, and it might be, but the reputation is really the driver. You know, and there's some things in the ranking that matter, like bar pass and employment and, you know, and other things that students really, you know, need to know. I'd really like to see something come in that's more around equity and diversity. There has been a change in the undergrad rankings, for instance, to look at how do institutions do on admitting students and graduating students that come from less elite backgrounds. And that's something that I think would be, a wonderful thought in law, because, I'm a big Bell Hooks fan about education being sacred and, potentially the great, equalizer. So we should care deeply about who's getting access to education and where they're getting that access.
So on that, that's actually something LST is working very hard on right now. Dean Rougeau actually hosted Law School Transparency up at Boston College right before the pandemic, where we discussed diversity and inclusion metrics to include in this new system of assessment that we're doing at law schools. And our goal here is to be deliberate, to be thoughtful, and be transparent in how we assess schools, so we can reward them for their valuable societal contributions. Right now, U.S. News doesn't really reward that. Even if some of the inputs make sense, when you add them together, it doesn't make sense. And so the reality, though, is that schools need something to respond to, some kind of incentive system that has market currency. And so what we're trying to do is figure out a way of giving credit to schools to devote more than words to meaningful objectives, particularly related to diversity, but also related to curricular innovation, transparency, and affordability. And I think until we really provide an incentive shift, we're not going to see any change in law school behavior, how they allocate resources, and how students respond to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really hard for a lot of the students that I work with is that, just to be frank, so you feel like you have to work twice as hard to get maybe even half as much professionally. And so I think it can be hard. Dean Rougeau, you were talking earlier about wanting to make good decisions financially, and that might be at maybe a lower ranked school. And I work with a lot of students who struggle with making the choice between maybe a larger scholarship at a lower ranked school and maybe not as much financial aid at a higher ranked school, but feeling like they need that prestige in order to get ahead as a person of color, especially a woman of color. How do we help students with that very real fact that the legal profession is elitist and still sort of racist and sexist?
Well, I think that's where, the local bars and employers can get involved with, the schools in their regions to let them know that, they have confidence in the schools and they're willing to recruit from the schools that in their communities, so that students can meet and see these employers when they go to the schools and know that there are real opportunities for them. Because one of the biggest mistakes students make is that they think they can actually plan their careers. They can maybe plan their first job. And I bet everyone here will tell you that their first job, was their first job, but it did not necessarily set the course of their career. It may have. I mean, sometimes that happens, but so much of what happens in a career is serendipitous. It's someone you meet, it's an opportunity you get, it's a move you make, and something comes out of that. So to over focus on the fact that I got into this higher ranked school, I'm going to have to go into deep debt to go there. My local state university is giving me a full ride, or 3/4, but it's not as prestigious. When you leave law school with little or no debt, and then you are able to get a good job in the region where you are, or maybe even a great job, because you might do super well and have opportunities that you didn't think you'd have. You're liberated in so many ways to make choices that will allow you to take opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be available to you. I can't tell you how many people feel locked into high status jobs because of their debt, but they're not the right jobs for them. Whereas people who have little debt can say, well, I can leave this job and take another one because, it's not going to be the end of the world. I can pay my rent, I can eat, I can do what I got to do. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things you have to weigh. And I think talking to people who've gone through that process from the various schools that you're considering can be really helpful, because you may meet someone in one of those sessions at, you know, the state law school that really inspires you and makes you feel good about making that choice. So, you know, I know law schools spend a lot of time trying to make sure that people know that, you know, that they offer opportunities to their graduates of a wide range of types. And I think students sometimes don't always listen because they've locked in their, or they're listening to their peers, or they're listening to other sources of information that aren't actually giving them the best advice. So I think in your position, Sydney, as a counselor, you can sort of alert students to the fact that, you know, you need to gather your information from better sources before you make a decision. You know, talk to graduates of the schools, talk to employers in the region. And again, the law schools usually make those opportunities available.
Mm-hmm.
I think it might be helpful to point like a very specific example of a student who might be choosing between, let's say, Harvard, Boston College, and one of the other smaller regional schools in Boston. It's rarely going to be someone choosing between Harvard and one of those smaller schools. They might be choosing between a very generous scholarship at BC and paying full price at Harvard. And I think people overestimate the difference between Harvard and BC in this case. And that's going to be the choice that they're more frequently going to be making. It's not going to be Harvard versus unnamed school. And so like, we can look at the US News rankings and say, yes, we can figure out who the very top schools are and say, maybe they get special consideration. But beyond that, the JD is a prestigious degree. It just is. Is it worth the cost and the debt and the turmoil always for people? Not necessarily, and it's important to make an informed decision. But I think people are overvaluing the small gradations, and I think that's just the hierarchy that US News is reinforcing. That doesn't necessarily reflect actual gradation.
I would also add too that, you know, anytime you're thinking about, you know, should I do something, the question is, well, what's my alternative? You know, what is the other pathway that I might choose? And one of the things that I really thought of, Sydney, when you noted that, you know, in law, there are still barriers, unquestionably. You know, I have felt them in many ways. I know they're both intentional and unintentional barriers put up for minoritized people, for, you know, in many different contexts. But I do think this, I think that for all law's faults, and there are many, I came to law to try and reform it. I came to legal education to try and reform it, even LSAC for reform. I think laws still are our best pathway to a just world. And I think that when we advise candidates about should I, shouldn't I, we should remember that the health and the strength of American legal education is quite remarkable when you look around the world. We have a lot of great law schools. The strength is really good. And the economic return for most decisions to go is very, very strong. There are some abuses out there, and that's the ones where, you know, work like Kyle's done and others have tried to make sure that people have the information they need to see that. But with that, I think it's pretty transparent today. And I think that the people coming to law school are more intentional because of that greater transparency. And they're just, you know, I think the key to know is that there's no one right way to do it, no one right place to go. There are so many different pathways, and you can make a great difference in all of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Dean Testy. And I just thank you all for that. Do you guys have any last words that you want to share on this process, on equity in law school as a whole?
I would just say thank you. It's been a real joy to be with you. Thank you and all the people that consult and work and support candidates, because as we've talked about today, there can't be too many of us trying to get the right word out. And I just want you all to know how much we appreciate you, and that LSAC is here for you as a resource. We do a lot of pre-law education. We work with all the pre-law advisors. Just let us know anything that's needed, and we'll do our best to be responsive.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just, again, thank you as well, and add, you know, to the potential law students out there that, you know, education is so critical in our world today. The complexity of the things that we're facing in our democracy, in our world are, nothing's getting easier. It's getting more and more complicated. Law is a great tool and a great ticket to managing and engaging that complexity and helping others move through that complexity in a way that will, enhance equity across the society. So if you're thinking about law school, I'm thrilled to hear it, and I want to support you. Take every advantage you can to get as much information as you can, but know that it's a good choice. And it will be something that not only contributes to you and your growth and development as a person and a professional, but is contributing to the betterment of our society if used properly.
I cannot come close to saying anything nearly as eloquent as both Dean Testy and Dean Rougeau said. So I will just say thank you for doing this today, and LST will be a resource to pre-law advisors and students for a long time to come, and I look forward to working with you all.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for that timely and important conversation on equity in law school admissions, recruitment, rankings, and debt. The issues of equity in recruitment and retention, information dissemination, financial equity, and how rankings impact equity go to the very heart of the law school admissions landscape. Make sure that you like this video and subscribe so that you can stay up to date on new information and topics on law school admissions. I'll see you very soon.